further ado, I welcome the first affirmative to open debate.
Firstly, a little bit of setup, then on why this legitimizes tariffs and why that is a bad thing, and lastly, on why we get stronger international relations. Firstly, a little bit of setup. What do these lack of negotiations look like? I think it just looks like not having negotiations doesn't necessarily mean that countries can't make it clear that the imposition of tariffs was a bad thing in the first place. It doesn't mean you cannot show that you're upset. It's just not negotiating with the US in terms of these tariffs. Second thing to note then is that Trump currently has quite an unclear path in terms of tariffs. Obviously, the Republican Party hasn't actually shown what their path is, what they're going to do in the future. You can clearly see this by the fact that they have both imposed and then taken off the tariffs very quickly. Clearly, they didn't have a clear plan. That was a particularly bad thing. Firstly, why does this legitimize the tariffs? First thing to prove is why countries will not be able to successfully move tariffs if they engage in the negotiation promise. First reason is because obviously this was an election promise for Trump. That means that he wants this policy to go ahead. He's likely to not completely take them off in the negotiation. Secondly, it is pretty hard to control the negotiation with Trump. I'd like to point out the example of Ukraine, where Ukraine and Zelensky was completely fucked over by Trump by having this crazy negotiation. Clearly, these inputs were very hard to control because the way that the US negotiates is particularly radical and kind of crazy in a way that can't be preempted, and that just means it's likely to go badly and not in favor of countries. Thirdly, I think the total removal of tariffs is quite against what the Republican Party wants. Because they've been using this as an election promise and because they've been using this as rhetoric, that means that when they remove these tariffs, they kind of concede that free trade perhaps was a good thing, and that is very counterproductive to the narrative that they're trying to push into the public. But lastly, it's just to say that the full removal of tariffs is quite a high level of commitment to make in a negotiation. And that is because countries that are negotiating with Trump have probably publicly just said why the administration is bad, and that just means that when they concede to this sort of thing, that makes the administration, Trump's administration, look particularly bad, and that's not something that they want to engage in the first place. What that means is, firstly, you're probably not going to be able to get every Western country able to remove these tariffs completely, but even in the case that you get some, obviously you don't get every Western country, so the benefits that you get are going to be minimal. At best, you get a partial reduction. I'm going to prove why that's actually quite a bad thing. Okay, what happens when they actually engage in these negotiations? Firstly, it probably looks like countries coming out relatively empty-handed because these negotiations don't go successfully for the reasons that I just told you. That is a particularly bad thing because they look quite powerless compared to the US. The rhetoric of that is a particularly harmful thing because that looks like the US having more control than they actually do. The public is then scared. That is quite a big harm because now the US seems a lot more powerful. Secondly, a partial reduction in tariffs is probably going to be celebrated in the country as a victory for the country, and that is a particularly bad thing because it means that, firstly, you support the narratives that the tariffs were not completely terrible to the point where you wanted to get rid of them completely, but secondly, you frame the tariffs as actually being all right, even though obviously free trade in general is actually quite a good thing. Thirdly then, it increases the capacity for the US to have tariffs in the first place, and that is because when you reduce the tariffs, that means the economic impact of the tariffs on the US individually is not going to be that bad. Obviously, when you impose tariffs, that means the price of things in the US go up. When you remove these tariffs, it means the price stays down. That means that these tariffs can stand for longer if they're reduced, and that just means that they're able to sit out on all of the criticism that they've been getting in the status quo about why these tariffs are particularly bad. That means that therefore, when individual countries are able to get these outcomes instead of every single country, which is something that is unlikely to happen as we've already proved, it means that every single other country suffers a lot more because they just get longer tariffs because the Trump administration never had the same amount of critique on their side. Fourthly, because it's likely that the US is going to set tariffs high when they know they can get concessions through negotiations. So because they're able to kind of control the game and things like that, they know that they're able to try and negotiate down lower prices, they're probably just going to go a little bit crazy. But fifthly, there's probably really bad flow on to international relations. And that is because the Trump administration has currently been defining what is acceptable in terms of relationships with other countries. They're able to get away with these crazy tariffs because you're legitimizing them by negotiating with them. Next step after that is probably doing things like messing with the UN structure because they know that they have the power to just kind of stomp all over other Western countries, or saying things like, oh, we're going to take over Greenland, which has already happened. This may seem far-fetched, that's maybe what they say, but I think that's just to say that, you know, maybe a couple years ago these tariffs also kind of seemed far-fetched, and yet they're still happening in the status quo. Fifthly, I think it's just to say, never mind. Okay, what do we have on our side? Firstly, we able to remove them regardless of, why are we able to remove them regardless of negotiation? Firstly, what is our worst case? I think it's just to say that the Trump administration is irrational, so negotiation was never going to go well in the first place, already proven that. But firstly, it's just to say the tariffs are really bad for the economy, right? So when they're implemented and when no change is created, obviously there's going to be a lot of backlash in their world from the public and things like that. That gives them an incentive to change these tariffs without the intervention from other countries. Secondly, when Western countries don't engage in this, either the Trump administration, because of the backlash, is forced to do two things. They're either going to have to remove it or they're going to reduce it, but they can't make that many concessions because they're unable to negotiate in the first place, which just meant that you're probably going to get more of a reduction instead of like sort of the flipping rhetoric that they're able to do if you're going into the renegotiation. But thirdly, it's just to say that businesses kind of are a big deal in the US, and that just means that when you don't enter into negotiations, businesses that you've already seen kind of backlashing against this in the status quo, for example, you know, Tesla and Elon Musk and things like that, are probably going to backlash quite hard against the implementation of these tariffs, and that means that the concessions are more likely to happen. And that is because when you negotiate with other countries, the US, and particularly Trump, has an incentive to try and appear as the most powerful actor in the negotiation, versus when it is companies that are internal, you don't have to make those same sort of like, we're so powerful sort of things, because it is within the country, and that just means that the tariffs are more likely to be removed. Impacts of this then is firstly on their side, you undermine free trade. That is really bad because firstly, it's hard to get back after you've already implemented it, after you've already conceded that perhaps tariffs were a good thing for your country. Why is free trade particularly good? Obviously, access to cheap goods, things like that. And also, it's particularly bad when you don't have free trade because only large companies are able to benefit, because when you have specialized countries not being able to access free trade, they're kind of fucked. Thirdly, it's better for all if it's removed instead of just some people getting some concessions, as I've already proved as a particularly bad thing. Secondly then, why we get stronger relationships between countries on our side. Firstly, it's because the West shows solidarity with non-Western countries who have also been fucked over by the tariffs. And that was a particularly good thing, because firstly, just building solidarity with other countries that you historically haven't is probably a good thing because you're reaching out, right? But secondly, I think you reverse a lot of the the West, non-Western divide that has been present in the past. And that just means that you're able to do things like invest in those economies, which are actually quite beneficial for trade in the first place. And that means that you're still able to engage in trade in a very meaningful way on our side. Secondly then, is because we're able to change relationships with a particularly strong actor, China, because it makes you less oppositional when you also stand in the same boat as everyone else and not defend something that is actually kind of radical and crazy, right? And also because like you're opposing these tariffs, China is a big trading partner, you'd probably side with China in this scenario. I think the impacts of this is, firstly, China is a very important country. Obviously, they have a lot of power in the global stage, so having relationships with China is a good thing. But secondly, you're probably able to just get more trade with China, which is a particularly good thing in this case because the US is acting irrationally. China probably wants trade. You're more able to build that relationship and get better trade in our world. So proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that speech. I now welcome to class negative.
things in this speech: setup and 2 arguments. And responses will be integrated throughout. Firstly, on setup, what does refusing to negotiate look like? Firstly, you just don't do negotiations. Secondly, we think they have to support that you never come to the table, that this refusal is quite absolute, like that you don't change in 2 weeks' time. Second question to ask is, what is the West? We think it's like the countries like the EU, like bodies like the EU, countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK. What do we do on our side? Knowing that this is a should policy motion, and as the negative team we have counterfeit, we think that we would firstly selectively enter negotiations with the US, and this could look like negotiating on whether tariffs are imposed in the first place, but also like the terms of them, such as the industries that are exempt, as well as like transition periods and things like that. Secondly, like the note that you just don't have to be a doormat. Like countries that are particularly smart, like they wouldn't necessarily agree to like terms such as like getting rid of all trans-affirming healthcare in their countries. They would say no. We don't have to support that. Alright, so first argument on why we decrease tariffs around the world. Firstly, noting that this argument operates on a sliding scale. You don't need to like, so we don't have to say that there are no tariffs on our side. We can just say that they're lower. We can say that they're imposed later. All of these are good things which I'll weigh later. So why are these negotiations likely done well? Several reasons. Firstly, often trade negotiations are done by like bureaucrats who are trade experts. They have a lot of skill, a lot of knowledge, particularly Western ones, because Western countries like do this a lot. They have a lot of experience, a lot of institutional knowledge, and this is particularly good because the note I'll add here is that these negotiations will tend to be done with US bureaucrats in a lot of instances, which are good, and they are more rational actors than Trump himself, which knocks out quite a bit of their material if you believe that some of these negotiations are done with bureaucrats. Secondly, that there's a big incentive for both countries to like negotiate because tariffs hurt both of them. These like negotiations are likely going to be productive because they both have an incentive to. Thirdly, these often these negotiations are behind closed doors, so they are less politicized. They are less like crucial to Trump's ego potentially. But fourthly, even when these negotiations look like people having to sit in the Oval Office in front of Trump, these are like powerful leaders. They represent their countries well. If Trump has like an unclear path with his tariffs as they present, this indicates that he's relatively like persuadable on them. I think it's quite good if these leaders come to his office to negotiate, and I'll step that through later. And fifthly, that these trade experts like know Trump's goals well through observation of his like years in office, so they're able to like kind of outsmart. They know his intentions, they know his goals, they can work around that. That's going to be quite successful. At the end of this, you should believe that these negotiations are likely to be done in quite a nuanced, successful way. And to respond at this point to their reasoning on how they're able to remove tariffs, with the main justification that tariffs are bad for the economy, so this gives the US an incentive to remove them. Firstly, I'll note that all the reasons that they gave why like they're bad for the economy are reasons why we would have leverage in these negotiations, so that they would likely go well because the US has an incentive to participate in them productively. But secondly, I would note that the short-term harms are simply not worth it. I'll get to this, but effectively in our argument, if we're able to persuade you that we get less tariffs like in the short term, rather than having to kind of wait for the US to suffer, for them to eventually like reduce or remove them, then that is better because these harms are quite massive. And then thirdly, per their analysis, on our side, like even if they only reduce these tariffs a little bit in the short term, then the US would experience like similar economic pressure from it being bad for their economy, and then they would eventually reduce or remove them in the long term. So the difference here is the benefit in the short term, which I will weigh. Alright, so why does Trump not back down to refusal to negotiation on their side? First reason is that Trump is a strongman leader. He doesn't like seeming like weak when he backs down, or like it seeming like he has backed down. It's a cornerstone of his personality. It's like what he runs on. He wants negotiations to happen. He's publicly stated this. He's said, like, you know, leaders can come to us, like they can come visit me, whatever, like we'll negotiate if people come to the table. And when you refuse to do this, you disrespect him, you antagonize him. He wants to seem powerful. He wants people to like come kiss the ring type thing. So he's likely to be productive when you do so. And secondly, that this is like a key election like issue promise, as Af noted. So he's unlikely to want to back down on this. He will impose tariffs at some point, as per this promise. And when the West refuses, stereotypes of like the EU being entitled and thinking it can get away with whatever it wants are confirmed. So this is actually worse on their side. like as 1A has said, all the reasons that they give for why negotiations don't work are reasons why here on their side, like you get tariffs still in place and Trump still doesn't back down, but on their side they're in full force in the short term as well. All right, so then why do we get concessions on our time? On our side, this looks like low or no tariffs. Firstly, Trump loves world leaders calling or visiting him. They can like make their case. They can explain to Trump. It makes him look powerful. It makes these leaders seem like they're making some kind of concession to him, even when they make no concessions in trade. He likes the visual of them being in the Oval Office, the handshake visual, whatever. And Australia was able to reduce some tariffs through this, like through coming to the Oval Office, talking to him, like talking him down. This is quite good. Secondly, this is better domestically in the US because the West is then seen as reasonable to like the US public, and therefore you get more pressure from the US public, from Congress, from aides, noting that negotiations are like a long kind of drawn out process a lot of the time with a series of counter offers. So when the West continues to make like reasonable counter offers, then there's increasing pressure each time from like all of these methods, Congress, aides, public, to Trump to be like, please, like we need this one, you need to accept it type thing. So there's a lot of pressure there. Next reason is that it stalls tariffs. So noting that these tariffs just are like necessarily delayed until after the negotiations are done, right? And often the negotiations are quite lengthy. This is the like nature of them. They're bureaucratic. They take a lot of time. So this is days, months, or years where there are no tariffs before they can finally be agreed upon. This is such a good thing. And then the next reason is just that often concessions can be buried in like the technical terms of some kind of agreement. So there isn't like a visible concession from Trump. There isn't this loss of face from him, which is his greatest concern, because it can be buried that like, oh, like we'll still have this like big headline tariff, but like it'll only come into effect after 6 months, or these industries are exempt. And this is the kind of thing that doesn't get reported on. It doesn't kind of damage his publicity as much, but it creates deeply tangible, important benefits for the people of these countries. At the end of this, we get less tariffs and they're like less impactful. Next part of this argument is to explain why developing countries get better negotiations, noting that these are the countries that have to negotiate on either side. They can't afford not to. We would prefer the West not to abandon them at this point in time. Firstly, the West is able to like coalesce and negotiate with like Trump together, like they're able to negotiate with the developing countries, and these new developing country negotiators can talk to the West negotiators. I've already set up why these negotiators are particular, like experts, they're particularly good. It's probably good if Ghana's negotiators, which are have much less expertise and power, can talk to the negotiators of the West and develop a coherent strategy together. Secondly, it seems more normal for negotiations to get more favorable terms. This is a norm that is set. This is good. So why is reducing tariffs the biggest impact in this debate? Firstly, tariffs are hugely inflationary. Like they increase the price of key essential goods for people. This increases cost of living. It's so bad. Secondly, that it increases input good prices for businesses. This looks like businesses having to pass on those costs to people, but also to fire people when these businesses are doing less well. Thirdly, this like increasing tariffs decreases economic trade, which means that the cost of conflict decreases, which means that it is less costly for countries to then engage in conflict with someone because they don't like lose as much trade. This is particularly bad, and also you lose the benefits of like specialization through comparative advantage on a global scale. This applies to both the West, developing countries, and US, because noting this is not an active debate, this benefits people in the US through less tariffs on them as well. So finally, on why refusing antagonizes the US-West relationship, several reasons. Appealing more to the US, like domestics, it makes you seem more reasonable. Secondly, this establishes useful communication channels. It strokes Trump's ego. It gives Trump a win on this issue, meaning he's more likely to concede on other things. If this relationship is damaged, it takes ages to repair. There are many global crises where we need a West-US alliance. This is so important, so proud to oppose.
Alright, after that speech, I now welcome second affirmative.
first thing I'm going to do in the speech is I'm going to explain to you why Emily's unresponded to material at first, about why pushing international norms and changing the ways that the US makes these claims is destructive for the global economy, is destructive for global political incentives. It changes the way people interact with each other on a state-to-state level, and it's incredibly destructive. That is by far the most certain impact in the debate, because for Trump, this gives him a new weapon to use. It demonstrates success. It shows the hand of the European bloc. Sorry, it means he's more likely to pursue these strategies in the future. Two things, I guess they might respond to this and say, he currently overclaims. What changes? Two things to say here. Firstly, it just means that he holds onto these policies for longer, even if he does eventually retract them. And that's incredibly harmful, right? Because the period between announcing those large tariffs and the period where he rolled back some of the tariffs resulted in an economic collapse. The global market took a massive dive. It meant that people lost their jobs. It meant that people lost their investments. They lost their home insurance. All these kinds of economic impacts obviously just extend for the time period of which he holds onto these claims. And obviously, if there's a demonstrated impact that the longer he claims something, the more likely someone is eventually going to come to the negotiating table and negotiation for concessions. Obviously, he's going to hold onto them for longer, even if he drops them eventually. That is a harm in itself. And also just note that because businesses, for example, view these as potentially more likely to happen, because concessions do actually get made and there is some level of tariffs which reduce their economic efficiency, it means they're just much more likely to take pernicious steps like firing people early, because they want to be economically prepared at the point where some tariffs get imposed, even if it's not the massive tariffs that get imposed eventually. Secondly, just note he is willing in some cases to go through it. And the simple explanation here is just that following through on threats is much harder when there is no potential benefit that you can look towards, which is just to say that it is a massive reputational harm or a harm on the international stage of taking an unpopular policy, or I guess pushing a particularly unpopular policy, but clearly at the point where you're likely to get negotiations instead, you just claim it more often, and when you do follow through with it, it means that it demonstrates your capacity to do so in the future, which makes it a more credible threat. So obviously, if he follows through in some of the absurd claims that he does, each of those instances has a massive harm, and is particularly likely to, because every single instance where he follows through on an absurd claim increases his negotiating capacity into the future, because it makes every other country more scared that he will actually do the things that he promises to do. That is particularly bad, because it looks like doing things like saying like you're going to take Greenland, and then eventually getting a resource deal when they capitulate to negotiations, which fucks them over into the future. It's things like making big claims on Taiwan, or giving large amounts of land to Russia, which fucks over international security. It fucks over particular countries and states that are completely insecure right now. It's doing things like stretching UN norms. For example, the WTO is an international institution where there's views that you can attack the norms that are set by international institutions. It means he's more likely to pursue things like weakening the WHO. That is incredibly bad for things like healthcare policy. It's bad for each person's buy into these organizations in the first place, because they're viewed as less binding to big countries that could fuck them over into the future. Even if these harms in themselves don't land, which means even if he doesn't actually follow through on these things, big claims create economic and political uncertainty, which means if he makes them more often, you just have to believe that economic markets are more unstable, that they change more often. You have to believe that it's harder for businesses and countries to plan their economic policy, because they're not sure when Trump might make the next big claim that fucks over corporations or makes the stock market go haywire. It means that politically it's much harder to do things like formulate your foreign policy, because you're not sure who the US is going to plan to attack next, because they hope that they can bring someone to the negotiating table by doing so. That is the most certain benefit in the debate, because at the very least it means they make these claims more often, they hold onto them for longer, and even if you don't follow through on these things, noting that he's an irrational actor, obviously that creates massive economic, political instability and harm to a large section of people. It fucks over the global economy, it fucks over political cooperation between all these countries. Second thing I'm going to do is talk about the material that they just gave you about why they get removal of the tariffs, because I think it's incredibly unresponsive and it's incredibly uncharitable. Firstly, they tell that negotiations are done by bureaucrats, which just means they're done well. They're probably done by bureaucrats that are relatively reasonable from the side of Western countries that are negotiating. But obviously, this assumes that Trump administration bureaucrats are particularly reasonable, and this is untrue for a number of reasons. Firstly, these are bureaucrats appointed by Trump, which means they're likely to ideologically align with him because they've stayed in office, whereas a large amount of people that don't align with Trump's ideological position or push back get fired for silly reasons because he has a massive ego and he hates being challenged, which means if you're a bureaucrat that's still close in the Trump administration, you just are pretty ideologically aligned with him by this point. It's a survivorship bias. Secondly, this also just explains that they are, in a lot of cases, irrational actors. Because who the fuck do you think put these policies together in the first place? It is the economic actors and the bureaucrats that were advising on the policies when they're being created that are the ones that go to the negotiating table. They are irrational actors. But thirdly, he is just unlikely to be persuaded by others because he has no incentive to do so. These other bureaucrats around him tell him that he should negotiate, that I guess he should negotiate or should try and get some tariffs in the first place. But firstly, he's probably kind of fine imposing some tariffs, but he's also just far more likely to eventually realize that these are economically unpopular and drop them in the first place. They tell you that if they're economically bad, then there is leverage for these countries, because they obviously, the less that the US, if the US doesn't make concessions and they do impose the full things, this would be economically bad for them. But obviously this just doesn't consider the timescale of this debate, right? Because they're still currently pretty fucking popular, because Republicans view these economic harms as not something that will actually occur, because it's not occurring right now. The tariffs haven't been implemented. A lot of Republicans in the base still believe that they're good because they protect America, because they're good and nationalistic. Obviously they buy into them under the status quo, but in the future, when the economic harms start to occur, if he imposes some of the tariffs, then they are just more likely to be dropped independently, because the Republican base is what turns against them, because they get fucked over by the policies the most. So clearly, if they're economically unpopular into the future, that's bad, but right now they don't have leverage, because Republicans and the base will still buy into Trump, even when these are actually economically harmful policies. They make a number of claims as well here to say that Trump likes being powerful, or he likes being perceived as powerful, but obviously this is just uncomparative, because these are reasons why he would be unlikely to make concessions in the first place. And the thing that I want to note here is that they give you a bunch of mechanization and framing that European leaders care about appearing strong to their people, so they'll advertise them as big wins when they get concessions. The thing I would note here is clearly, if they're advertising them as big wins, it makes it pretty fucking hard to do things like hide concessions in terms, because European countries are reporting in the international media that we got this concession from Trump, because they're acknowledging that these are pretty good deals for them. So if they are good deals for these countries, obviously they're going to be pretty publicized, and the Republicans are going to know that Trump is weak. So those perceptive benefits do actually accrue to the point where he gets into negotiations. But finally, we just explained that they explained that tariffs are likely to be stalled during, but clearly this is untrue, because it reduces their power. Because if the tariffs are in action when they're negotiating, European leaders are negotiating from the perspective of someone whose people are currently suffering economic harms. That clearly gives far more power to the Trump administration. They're likely to do that and be willing to copy economic harms that are occurring to them, because the other country is vulnerable, and because they're less likely, I guess, to have like a completely irrational voters, for example, in their states that are unlikely to turn against them. I think at the end of that, it is relatively clear that these negotiations aren't going to be good or aren't likely to be made. But incredibly importantly, there are likely to be some tariffs, because we explained to you that where there are, I guess that the Trump administration still has incentives to pursue these policies to some extent, and this is particularly bad because it normalized tariffs. Because even if you can frame it as a relative success that a concession gets made, or that you do end up having some tariffs in the future, that is just incredibly bad, right? Because it means people are more likely to impose tariffs in the future. It's viewed as a more legitimate means of negotiating on an international scale, of threatening tariffs on other people. And the more that you use that, the more it creates things like economic uncertainty, the more it legitimizes unwise and difficult forms of foreign policy, which restricts people's access to products, which raise prices on a global scale. That is incredibly bad, and we shouldn't legitimize it. We shouldn't change this norm, and we shouldn't affect it. Their last explanation on developing countries is just to say that they can ask the Western countries for advice and negotiate well. But obviously, if he can negotiate with the West, he has no incentive to capitulate to these other countries, because he can reduce his own economic harms by negotiating with the West, and then I guess offset those harms with smaller countries that just have less power to do things like demand concessions, because they have less capture of the American market, and they're less powerful internationally. So obviously, he's going to reduce the Western countries' harms first, and not reduce the harms to developing countries who remain. And also, Western countries just probably don't have the incentive to give this advice as much when they're not getting imposed as a whole. They can do pressure, they can do collective action as a bloc, and force Trump to drop these tariffs entirely. It's incredibly important that he can't negotiate with individual countries and get concessions, and then other countries get fucked over instead. This it increases international cooperation. It's particularly good for certainty economically and politically, so proud of that.
Alright, with that speech, I now welcome Second Negative.
is unfortunately true that Trump is not a very great guy in both worlds, but he's only here for probably about 4 years, 3.5 now. So the side that successfully reduces the immediate impact of these tariffs and also the long-term irreparable international relations harms that each side might potentially cause wins this debate. So 3 key issues. Firstly, do we legitimize tariffs and what impacts this have in the long term in terms of negotiations between Western countries and so on? Secondly, do we effectively reduce the number, the scope and effect of tariffs on these countries, Western countries in particular and non-Western countries as well? And finally, what impacts do we have on international relations norms more broadly? So, on this first point, do we legitimize tariffs? Opposition's key claim here is that by coming to the negotiation table, Western countries sort of concede power to Trump, this makes him more likely to impose these tariffs in future. Also, doing things like celebrating these tariffs as a victory in the EU makes Trump seem like he's seem like some more moderate tariffs are a legitimate thing to do, and so on. So, firstly, to flip this claim, if you negotiate with Donald Trump and you appear to be as reasonable as possible, come to the negotiation table as many times as you can without necessarily conceding anything big, which we've told you we can do because our bureaucrats are relatively expert. I'll get to that more later. This makes the average US voter see you as far less of an opponent than they would in opposition as well, which makes it far less legitimate that Donald Trump can continue to employ these tariffs into the future. He can continue to do more tariffs on these countries after they've repeatedly tried to negotiate. And even if the average voter is going to do this, congressmen and congressmen are obviously slightly smarter than the average Trump voter, most likely. So it seems far less legitimate, particularly to moderate Republicans who still have some role in determining whether bills pass the House and so on, that we can continue to tariff these countries going into the future. Secondly, both sides can see that there are clear economic harms for Americans with these tariffs, both immediate and long term. So it's unclear that Trump could ever do a second or third round of tariffs going forward, even if some norm existed that they might work, because they still harm Americans directly, and there's only so much that Americans are going to take. This makes Democrats look far more reasonable when they promise to negotiate with these countries and cut tariffs completely. This takes away a significant amount of Trump's power, which means that this does not mean that more tariffs are likely to occur going into the future. Opposition cannot win on the idea that even if we reduce the harm of the tariffs now, we're going to get more and more going into the future. This doesn't make sense. Now, onto the point of whether we actually reduce tariffs in the immediacy. So, firstly, are negotiations an effective way of reducing these tariffs? So, opposition brings you three key claims here. Firstly, the United States as a whole is an irrational negotiator that is hard to read. This looks like the Zelensky example they bring, where Zelensky was kind of screwed over. So, firstly, he is not a Western power like Ukraine. This was a power play that affected him because he didn't have the skills required to mitigate it. A better example was the Keir Starmer handshake thing or the Macron handshake thing, where an experienced diplomat knew to shake Donald Trump's hand in the right way to not give him control. It's the minor things, it's the minor areas of negotiating skill that mean that we get far better impact in the West. Because our negotiators in the West are for the most part experts. Both sides sort of accept that the Western negotiators are going to be experts. Now, secondly, are the American negotiators reasonable people? So, firstly, even if you accept that the top-level American negotiators, the head of the head of the tariff department, whatever, is ideologically aligned with Trump, the much lower-level policymakers are still public servants who have got their job through having some incentive to work in the public service. It's very underpaid, particularly in America. So they have some incentive in preserving the country as a whole. This also looks like America, this looks like Trump aides, attempting to moderate him whenever they can in his previous administration, because they know that they can't have the country completely fall apart. So what this looks like is it looks like smaller policymakers hiding small details about concessions, these tariffs in the negotiations. And secondly, it seems quite likely that Trump probably doesn't read the full text of the tariffs anyway, because he's interested in essentially the optics and not the actual economic outcomes. He's using it as an election tool. So it seems very likely that we can hide small details that significantly reduce the effectiveness of this tariff, things like waiting periods and so on, in the details that Trump most likely will not find out about. It is very plausible this will happen because there are so many people involved in creating these tariffs and negotiating them that that are fundamentally like aligned with reducing the impact on America as a whole. So therefore, even if the top level negotiators, the people actually in the room, aren't the most reasonable, the people handing them the documents to negotiate on are likely to be far better, we can still have good negotiations. So this proves that we most likely can reduce tariffs for like a large number of Western countries, which is obviously a win for all the weighing we give you at first. You know, it reduces inflation, reduces harm to the global economy as a whole. We can win on this alone. But now, let's talk about non-Western countries, whether reducing these tariffs firstly draws out, like, whether reducing tariffs on Western countries, firstly draws out tariffs in non-Western countries, and secondly makes them like more intense in the first place. So firstly, like, will tariffs on countries who don't negotiate draw out? Firstly, it's unclear why this would be, like why this would be the case, because there's still symmetrical economic harm to Donald Trump and to America. Like if you have a tariff of 5% for a year, or a tariff of like 0.2% for however many more years. So like if it appears the administration cares about the economy in the long term, it's unclear why this is the case. Secondly, it's less popular with voters to have a long-term, drawn-out tariff, even if it is perhaps less impactful, because it's in their mind for longer. It's in their mind when we come to like the next election cycle. So it is worse for Donald Trump to have these tariffs drag out for longer. It's more likely he will like negotiate them in the short term, even in case. And finally, like Donald Trump's only here for 4 years, so it's better if we draw out these tariffs in the long term for countries who don't negotiate, because it means the impact is likely lower in this 4-year period. And since I've already proven what, like, both sides have proven why they're so like unlikely to benefit Americans long term, it's likely they'll probably be repealed with the next administration anyway. So this is fundamentally a good thing if we draw out these tariffs and make them more minor. Now, at the end of this point, I think I've proven effectively that these tariffs are likely to be less intense on like Western countries and also countries who don't negotiate. Noting as well that non-Western countries will likely have to negotiate in both worlds because they're so impacted by the American economy and so on. They don't have the power to hold out. So it is far better that the Western countries side with the non-Western countries for a few reasons. So let's talk about IR now. I don't know the start of this, but opposition sort of contends the case on like the US-Western relationship not being as important as the relationship between Western countries and between developing countries. Like this doesn't seem to be necessarily true because obviously like the US is an important player in NATO. So even if we have harms to like the relationship between non-Western countries and Western countries, we can still win on the fact that the US is more reasonable. And I'll get to why they're more reasonable in a second. But secondly, like it's likely that in their world, if no one negotiates, the suffering is likely going to be unequal between developing countries and developed countries. So we see that like developed countries have lower percentage tariffs anyway and can withstand them more. So like it appears that so there is likely to be a perception of inequality there. Whereas on our side, if the Western countries negotiate and negotiate in cooperation with non-Western countries, even if it's not effective for non-Western countries, it seems less antagonistic because the Western countries are at least trying to help out. So we fundamentally get better relationships there. But since opposition, since they fail to prove that the US relationships are not insignificant, we can win on this alone because again, Trump has limited political capital, so we would prefer to negotiate on things like tariffs and concede some things on tariffs than on things like NATO, which Trump is much more likely to pull out of in their world. We win on IR, so proud to negate.
Thank you for that speech. I now welcome the affirmative to conclude the assembly day.
The first thing I'm going to do in the speech is talk about tariffs, and then I'm going to talk about Trump's playbook. Firstly, let's talk about tariffs, and I want to make really clear in this speech that negotiation incentives from the Trump government and the position of relative parties is likely to change over time. The important nuance that we bring you in Emily's speech is that you're unlikely to get concessions right now, and that is the important thing, that I think quite an important thing to prove. It is important that things can change later. That is still a harm for them in this debate. Okay, can you get concessions right now? We say no, and we explain it with a couple of reasons. Firstly, this was an election promise that is still relatively important, relatively popular right now, because none of the economic effects have been particularly realized by individuals. There has been no sustained inflation as a result of Trump announcing that these tariffs come into place, and most people aren't necessarily that impacted by what occurs on the stock market. But then the second reason why you're unlikely to get things right now is they say Trump wants to look like a strongman. Obviously, his strongman image is improved if he can say, Canada called, I told them to fuck off, they don't get any concessions from me. Just because Trump wants to look like a strongman and that people are coming to the door to negotiate doesn't mean he has to give them concessions in these circumstances. But thirdly, we explain
explained that Trump is in a particular negative position even when making minor concessions because, as we explained, this means that relatively few countries are likely to get these concessions because it's popular. As Felix said in his speech, when countries do get concessions, they're likely to celebrate this as a demonstration, like the political party within that state has an incentive to celebrate it as a demonstration of their negotiating deftness and their ability to be one of the only countries that has pulled back Trump from the brink of doing something really harmful, which means you don't get minor concessions that Trump doesn't know about. This becomes a major piece of discourse in the international sphere. Of course, Trump is aware about it and has incentive to give no concessions in these circumstances, and as we also explained, has no incentives to pause the tariffs because obviously the US gets more leverage if that country is currently suffering and the impact on the US is relatively less immediate. What does this mean? In the negotiation circumstances, the US has all of the leverage right now, and also notably, a revealed preference to not allow countries any negotiating capacity. Like Anthony Albanese did try to negotiate with the US from a relatively good position, right? Because we have one of the best balances of trade for them and a relatively strong natural resources industry that they care about, and Trump still told him to fuck off. A lot of the kind of choices that Trump is making about tariffs are not because individual countries are asking for them, it's just because the Republicans don't really know what's going on. So the negotiations here don't make them more persuadable because they just don't have an understanding of the policy in the first place. The negotiations don't change this because of the other things that I've identified there. So, even if they can explain to you that the way the West attempts to engage with this is to do it well, it actually doesn't matter in this debate. You can have the best possible negotiators that you want, but if you're doing it from a position of weakness, where Trump is trying to maintain a particular image, it literally does not matter in this debate. But let's say, even if you don't buy the stuff about leverage, why is this still really bad for countries? We tell you the particular bureaucrats that you're likely to be negotiating with are crazy. They tell you, well, bureaucrats care about the country running pretty well. But obviously, if you look at what Elon Musk has been doing, gutting the American public service, and the fact that they tell you these people are underpaid in the first place, probably means the only people who remained in the Trump administration are people who are supportive of the Trump message in the first place. But secondly, I actually think this is undermined by their own framing that they do at First Speaker. When they tell you that this looks like Trump's telling other world leaders that his doors are open, he's forcing this to be a public political show where they come to him in the first place and then get turned down. So it's actually not likely to be bureaucrats at all. It is likely to be negotiations between individual leaders with Trump because, once again, that is what improves his strongman image in these circumstances. So that increases the likelihood of missteps by negotiators and things that make them look particularly foolish. See the example of Zelensky there. Also likely to happen for the West. Obviously, Trump is quite ideologically opposed to a lot of the relatively progressive parties that are in power right now, so has no incentive necessarily to uphold them just because they were kind of culturally kind of more close. They say, well, actually what this might get is American Congress people and stuff like that thinking that you're more reasonable for agreeing to negotiations in the first place. But I would just note that a lot of the Congress people that have a poor view of the West right now are just Republicans in general who are focused on prioritizing America's interest in the world. Like it's an America first isolationist stance that is swept through Republicans right now. So I don't think this individual issue makes you feel better. It's a much brighter perceptual problem with the West. The second thing is they just have other issues with the West that this negotiation doesn't necessarily change. They still view Europe as not doing enough on NATO right now. So just because Europe negotiates with this or doesn't negotiate with this, it doesn't change the more broader issues these Congress people are likely to have America there. So that's really important because it just means that they cannot claim a large reduction to tariffs. Maybe in the best case they get a partial reduction to tariffs. And we explain that this is bad that these negotiations fail right now when they try to enter into them because it means that people domestically just feel like Trump has total power over them, and it makes the average person feel worse. They feel more insecure about international affairs. They feel as if their leaders are powerless against it. So by even pretending to stand strong, even if you don't have any power, you don't submit yourself to that harm occurring as well. But the second thing that we explain, and really importantly, is that the partial success of these tariffs is also really bad, because the point which the leaders are celebrating still having some degree of tariffs on there, it delegitimizes the free trade, the free trade regime in the first place. It makes it less likely that they're going to use positive rhetoric on that, because they need to sell this as a win, right? So it's hard to go back to that afterwards. That's really important, because they cannot get any of these benefits right now, and even when they do get some success, it's still a harm. But how does this change in the future? We explained specifically that the harm of the tariffs, when they are particularly bad right now and are universal and apply to almost all countries, is so bad that you're likely to change relatively quickly. They say not that long, Trump's maximally in power for 3 years. 3 months versus 3 years is still a huge benefit under our side of the debate. Notably as well, American democracy is somewhat deteriorating. It's not necessarily clear that the Republican Party is not in power after this. What we explained to you specifically at Emily, to really no response, is that once the impact of this tariffs causes a massive rise in inflation, people in America will likely realize the economic harms, and that is the circumstance where Trump realized that he no longer has the strongman persuasion power to get through this, and realized that an attempt to kind of maintain his power in these circumstances, quell discontent, or maintain his base, and maintain his capacity to do things like try for a third election by removing these tariffs in these circumstances. What happens under their world is he's still obviously going to try and in their world is he shoulder taps individual countries and says, do you want to negotiate now to remove these particular tariffs? So he's actually able to maintain the system for a much longer period of time, right? Because obviously, if he can reduce the impact of the tariffs by negotiating with particular European countries or removing some things in Australia in the first place, every other country has to suffer for a longer period of time because the US has determined that is the acceptable amount of economic harm. And people are willing to accept a smaller amount of economic harm, like maybe they still see it as in America's national interest, but they're not willing to accept a large amount of economic harm. What happens on the outside of the house is because you cannot negotiate with individual countries, you have to remove these tariffs en bloc, or the concessions have to be unilateral from America, both of which decrease Trump's position of power in these circumstances and reduces the amount of tariffs much quicker. The fact that it is a longer span of time, though, even marginally, is more important. The longer this tariff regime is in place and the more legitimized it is by these negotiations, means that other countries also try and engage in protectionist policy. It means that the market is held off kilter for a longer period of time because the uncertainty about when tariff removes increases, but it also means that countries' economies are restructured by the existence of these tariffs in the first place. So even if they're small under their side of the house, it means that every country's economy becomes less efficient in the long term, the more it restructures to deal with the fact that now their exports are like tariff to the US in these circumstances. They have to do more things like protectionism and farming and stuff like that. Okay, that explains why we're in this debate on the economic thing, but I want to quickly explain the stuff about the Trump playbook as well in general. This is unresponded to by the negative team, and we explain very clearly that it's a tipping point. It demonstrates to Trump how easily the West will bow to attacks on international institutions. And right now that looks like the World Trade Organization, relatively legitimate, relatively entrenched. What it probably looks like tomorrow is the World Health Organization. It probably looks like the ICJ, it probably looks like attacks on the UN. Because this just demonstrates if Trump wants to get rid of something, the West will not try and stop this, it will just try and negotiate it to make the harm a little bit less bad. That's really important. It encourages an expansion of this campaign over the future. These issues all have their own benefits, right? Like obviously the impact of Trump declaring that he wants to get rid of funding for the World Health Organization is less malaria vaccinations for other people across the world. So on a relatively small margin, even if you believe that they're ahead on tariffs, this is likely to be a relatively small economic cost because we explain in the long term why these are likely to be removed. But Trump targeting every single other international institution and similarly reducing that power is a harm that occurs over the long term continuously. Proud to propose. Woo.
Thank you for that speech. I also have a negative debate.
There is an exceedingly small list of actors that the West outright refuses to negotiate with. The EU is currently involved in negotiations with the Iranian Ayatollah about their nuclear program. That list includes pirates, it includes terrorists, and in affirmative world, it includes Donald Trump. That is a disaster for this team because it pokes the bear of the US in the issue of international relations. But much more importantly, it absolutely wins us the debate very clearly on tariffs. Because one thing to know about these tariffs is they're a lot harder on the US's enemies than they are on the US's friends. And when you do not even refuse to get into the room with Trump, then you become an enemy. You get the type of things you become associated with China, that like tariffs on the EU and stuff are a whole lot worse. I'll first talk about tariffs into the longer term, then I'll talk about these immediate set of tariffs, and finally I'll talk about international relations. Let's start on the longer term tariffs, not because it's the most important part of the debate, but because it's their path to victory. Their first claim here is that this legitimizes tariffs more generally, which means that there's more ability to have tariffs in the global stage. One, I don't think it does. I think you can absolutely still criticize criticize these tariffs. You do not have to be like, yay, it's really good that Trump is only like doing a little bit. I think you can still say that is deeply regrettable. It is better that this tariff is lower, and I think that's particularly important there. Even watered down what tariffs can be bad, but I think having less tariffs more generally is better. But secondly, I think we legitimize something really good, which is just negotiations, both in terms of tariffs more generally, but also just in terms of the precedent of getting people from different opposing with views who are in a conflict in the same room. I think it's much better to have negotiations in the Oval Office than in the forum of media and Fox News, or even in our if we're going to be remotely charitable, some delegates also going into the back room of the Oval Office. It's not like they're going line by line through the tariff details with Maloney in the Oval Office and that type of stuff there. Thirdly, you still legitimize tariffs in these negotiations on their side of the house. As we explained to you at Mayor, developing countries are still likely to negotiate because they do not have the power to hold these tariffs out into the longer term. So, essentially on their side of the house, you say the precedent that the US can bully the developing world, even if you believe that they can't bully the developed world. I think that's still a harm for us, a harm for them, because I think they're able to, that disproportionately hurts lower income countries and countries that are not the West. At least on the outside of the house, everyone can band together and you are able to do better stuff there. Cool. Also, I'm just unclear what the impact long-term of legitimizing tariffs is. I think the biggest thing of tariffs in the global economy currently is Trump and these sets of tariffs. It's entirely unclear the sets of actors that they potentially might imagine might happen in the future. What do they try and explain in terms of the long-term of their path to tariff reduction? Their main claim is that you will get tariffs removed into the long term by really fucking up the US economy. Firstly, I would just reject this premise. I don't know if tariffs actually really fuck up the US economy, and particularly the types of actors that are likely to support Trump. This just looks like onshoring of different things. Things like LVMH setting up factories in the US South, which do employ people. This is Trump's base. This is the Republican base. This is incredibly popular. Maybe inflation goes up, but you would blame that on crime, on illegal aliens, and on failed Democrat policies. But at least your base has jobs on the outside of the house. Secondly, I think this is good for US businesses, US-based businesses, because it's a form of protectionism which privileges them, privileges their ability to sell things to the domestic market. And maybe the retaliation is bad, but you can just say, oh, that's China being really evil there. Thirdly, I think this often takes years and years of pain to apply and buy. And I would note that Trump does not have a re-election incentive here. He's not unlikely to come to the table. He is very ideological, he's ego-driven, he's likely to do this out. But finally, even if this hurts people, it's entirely unexplained to this team what the average working class person in America getting really fucked over by this tariff is, and those tariffs going down, I think they are just likely to suffer in silence a lot of the time. That's there. I think, and I think the final thing to note under this is you will never get repeals on their side out, because that is the biggest admission of guilt and of oh, this is actually a bad thing that Trump could ever possibly do, and certainly not the total repeal that we get, that they try and claim. Maybe in the long term, 3 years from now, they get some of the concessions that we get right now. There's still a loss for this affirmative team. But finally, this is so not worth it. One, for people in the US, if you have to freeze to death in their homes because energy is so expensive in order to try and get some long-term aim or for speculative benefit, I do not think that is worth it. But secondly, internationally, this is absolutely terrible. As we explained in Mayo with a range of reasons, these tariffs are really terrible there. LA's analysis about, oh, you are able to get a change of administration into the long term also just indicates that if tariffs were applied on our side of the house too, in the worst case, we co-opt this mechanism. Why, if you've negotiated initially, but these tariffs really fuck up the US, wouldn't Trump just lift them on our side of the house? I think this indicates that their mechanism on path to victory is just entirely symmetric. Finally, I'll explain why avoiding short-term harms is more important than long-term benefits. One, it is just much more certain. We do not know what will happen in trade and IR in the global economy 3, 4, 5 years from now. We know what is happening right now. We have an obligation to people and to protect them there. But secondly, doing stuff in the short term is the best way to ensure long-term flourishing. It allows people to have more savings. That's particularly important. Second, let's talk on the short term here. I think that dulling the blow is much more important than IR, because the biggest current threat to IR is these tariffs, and also countries not trading with each other, not being integrated. I think getting these tariffs done in the short term is the most important part of the debate. We explained that there's a sliding scale of types of concessions. You can just stall it. Maybe the tariffs don't get applied while you can negotiate. You can bury things in the detail. You're going to exempt certain industries. You can do things like increasing NATO contributions, which Trump also wants. And maybe these tariffs go away entirely. Reducing tariffs by far is the biggest impact in the debate. Mayor explains they're hugely inflationary, they increase input good prices, and they clearly win us on the economy issue. Let's deal with their claims then. They say that you guys are still publicize reductions in tariffs, so Trump will not do concessions because that makes him seem weak. The problem is that this only applies in the foreign media, entirely unclear why the US consumer is doing that. And I would say that the US has a lot of media, Trump has a lot of media control. Look at the press room. He is able to spin this. He's able to say our great friend Australia came to us because we are really powerful. And finally, we are getting some stuff again. Maybe we got more like Australia would pay slightly more into AUKUS. That's particularly good. That's good for security there. That's good for charity. The next claim is that Trump wants to rebuke Shamu like Zelensky. This is our worst case, but I think we still win because that means you still acquiesce to Trump's demands. You keep him on side. You develop a working negotiation relationship, which is important. But secondly, this is not always what he wants to do. He's expressed like that he wants people to come to the table. He wants people to be able to negotiate. His whole fucking thing is the art of the deal. Obviously, he wants to negotiate. He thinks he will be good in that stuff. I'm next going to explain why the US has incentives to make concessions now. One, because you just seem like a friend, as I explained in my introduction. You can wine and dine him. You can like do his ego a little bit. Like he loved it when like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un do these types of things. Maybe we should give the West the same opportunity to do that here. But secondly, all of us found this analysis about business pressure is precisely the reason you get concessions right now. And thirdly, I just think, as I explained, Trump wants people to pick up the phone. When you do it, he's likely to make some series of concessions. What that means is that more countries will come to the negotiating table in the future. If he is entirely unreasonable as a negotiator, then no country will come to the table, no developing country, all that sort of stuff. You're more likely to do that. The next claim is that Trump negotiators are irrational and evil and not reasonable. Firstly, like these trade agreements are fucking massive. You need so many people going through the lines. It's unclear that every single person going through it is like really evil and Trump apparatchik. Secondly, they're likely trained in economics. They probably do have a good understanding of like maybe reducing certain parts of the tariffs are quite good. But thirdly, that actually gives them a really good negotiating position because they're able to weigh Trump's interests on other things. So now maybe the EU is like, okay, we'll actually do our NATO contributions if you put the tariffs down. I think that's particularly beneficial there. They leave developing countries out to dry when they're the only ones doing the negotiations, whereas we are able to like do institutional knowledge. And obviously, Trump does not highball in response because he's probably already highballed. He's already done his opening bid. Incredibly, incredibly proud to oppose.
Alright, thanks everyone. We'll get no feedback or away, but you can take a break.
Yes, of course.
Alright, hello. I'm recording this so that you guys can have hopefully a better explanation of the result than I could give at break night. In terms of the result, as I'm sure you found out by now, we awarded this to the negative team, and we did so on an extremely narrow margin. We had a unanimous call, but we both thought it was extremely close. So congratulations to Melbourne and commiserations to ANU. I have two pieces of general feedback. The first is that I don't think anyone in this debate really gave us what felt like a logical and coherent explanation of why Trump is doing tariffs in the first place. Both teams at various points claim he's being irrational. I'm not really sure this is true. What I wanted to hear is, why did he even make this election promise in the first place? And if it's not economically rational, what larger narrative or political goal does this fit into? This would have been, I think, very explanatory about what Trump is likely to do next. Would he or would he not negotiate? And if he does negotiate, what is he going to ask for? My second piece of general feedback is, I think the kinds of concessions that countries would have to make in this negotiation process are under-discussed. Negative says, you would not accept anything too extreme, but I still have questions about what Trump would actually be asking for, even if I now understand what countries would be willing to accept per your fiat. And then I'm also not explained, it's not explained to me how I would weigh these concessions that you'd have to make against the benefit of reducing tariffs. And what's the weighing of why giving those concessions up would be worth getting the reduction in tariffs. Obviously, in the more extreme cases, affirmative does provide some examples of things tariffs could be used to target, like the WHO and the UN. But what I'd like to hear more of is what kind of concessions Trump is asking of the UK, or of France, or of Germany, and why those concessions worthy of being traded off against the reduction of tariffs. I think that needs to be the biggest part of the debate, but I think it's interesting that teams don't really mention it at all. In terms of the decision, I'll go through it in a couple steps. First step, I suppose, I was persuaded by the negative team that Western countries could negotiate meaningful reductions in tariff rates in the short term. That was for a few reasons. Firstly, I think the negative team is able to explain how this could be done in a way that has benefits for Trump's image, which is that he's a good negotiator, he's able to make deals for the American people. Secondly, I think they're able to explain why it is in his interest to make these concessions or make these reductions in tariffs meaningful. And that's the logic that giving nations that choose to negotiate reduced tariffs makes other countries more likely to negotiate as well. And finally, because I think Affirmative's analysis about how bad keeping very high tariffs into the long term would be for the US is a little bit in tension with their claim that the US has no incentive to reduce tariffs in exchange for concessions right now. Because if it's true that keeping tariffs really high is so deleterious to the US economy, then it seems intuitive to me what Negative says, which is there's some incentive for him to make concessions and reduce tariffs in exchange for other countries offering certain things. Now, I'll acknowledge here that the Affirmative team does also give a characterization of how, these making concessions and making a deal could look bad for Trump. I think there are a few ways that the Negative team defeats this. One is by observing that Trump has a large degree of media control in the US, which helps to explain why their characterization of it being spun as a win is more likely. But additionally, I think by explaining why there's an incentive to try and do this and spin it as a win, they're able to persuade me he would probably attempt to do that, which I think is why I believe with a relatively high degree of certainty, countries would be able to get very meaningful reductions of tariffs through negotiations. The second step then in this decision is I think significant doubt was thrown on the claim that if countries refuse to negotiate, Trump will eventually have to withdraw all tariffs into the long term. That was for a few reasons. Firstly, because I do not think Affirmative painted a clear picture of how Trump would go about repealing tariffs in the long term without some kind of negotiation process, without causing a large amount of damage to his image. Something I think Negative is able to impact particularly well at Third. Secondly, because Negative is able to mitigate the extent to which economic harms are capable of convincing Trump to allow damage to his image. So they say things like, for example, he doesn't have a re-election campaign to win, he can blame inflation and other factors, he can point to positive impacts of tariffs like onshoring manufacturing. Now, this claim, or this thing I've just said, might seem in tension with the previous thing I said, which was that large harms of tariffs in the long term create this incentive for Trump to make concessions now. The reason why I don't think those two things are in tension is because concessions made now can be spun as a victory. Concessions made in the future, in the absence of negotiations, are clearly a big loss. And thus, the long-term economic harms of tariffs are an incentive for Trump to do concessions now in the present when negotiations occur, but it's not proven that those or at least I think mitigated, the extent to which those long-term harms of tariffs will cause him to make concessions on those tariffs into the future. Third reason then why I think doubt is thrown on the claim that in the long term Trump will end up having to remove tariffs is I'm not convinced that negotiations will lock in a permanent regime of tariffs by normalizing the existence of some tariff rate, which is one of the long-term claims that Affirmative makes. The reason why I'm not convinced of that is I think Negative explains that you can claim success in getting tariffs reduced, but still say that tariffs should be zero. So that is, countries in this negotiation process are unlikely, or per fiat, I guess, Negative team claims that they would do this, would not, normalize that tariff rate, would continue to negotiate going forward. Finally, I don't think it's explained why, if Trump does choose to drop tariffs lower at some point in the future due to their economic impacts, that drop would be to zero. I think Affirmative rather assumes that if you leave tariffs very high right now, eventually he'll have to make them zero. But I don't think they actually prove that, which means at the end of this, I think it's a little bit speculative how much and when Trump would eventually have to reduce tariffs, and enough mitigation is done to make me believe that he might not ever do it during his term because it would be a large damage to his image and he has other ways of dealing with it. Or if he does, it might be smaller than Affirmative thinks and further away into the future than Affirmative thinks. Okay, that's the most important issues in the debate. There are some other issues that I think are worth discussing. Firstly, on developing countries, I think this section of the debate is quite messy. Specifically, it was messy because I wasn't certain of the relationship between Western negotiations and negotiations occurring with developing countries. Both teams concede developing countries will have to negotiate now because they're poorer and they need to mitigate the short-term harm of tariffs. Affirmative characterizes the strategy of refusing to negotiate, or Western countries refusing to negotiate, as a long-term approach, which makes it hard to understand the interaction between that refusal and then these developing countries making negotiations right now in the present. And maybe there's some long-term benefit there of causing the tariffs to take a bigger toll in the US, but it's not really made clear what the response of the US is and why that's a universal reduction in tariffs, as I mentioned previously. On the other hand, Negative claims that they can all negotiate together somehow. But I think there are also issues with this because it's not really explicit enough what kind of strategies and bargains are being employed here in order for Western countries negotiating to translate into benefits for developing countries as well. So that issue I don't think is hugely decisive. Next, on the impact on international relations, and particularly the sort of New World Order and the UN and the WHO and those other kinds of international institutions, my panelist actually credited this claim a lot less than I did. She thought that it's not explained why Trump would not find other ways to get rid of the WHO or the WTO, whatever institutions he doesn't like. I'm not certain the burden on the affirmative team is this high in the absence of a direct response from the negative team. I do think, however, that hurts the comparativeness of the argument a little bit. And additionally, I think the argument itself might be a little bit speculative, but I do believe it and I do credit it. Ultimately, the decisive factor for me is I believe with a relatively high degree of certainty, you can get a quick reduction in tariffs now. I think it's unclear that any future reduction in tariffs would happen, or that if such a reduction would occur, it would be any better than the one we could get right now. Perhaps Trump will now use tariffs as a bargaining tool more often, but it's not clear that that is preferable to tariffs being, if not permanently high for a very long time. The weighing there is still a little bit difficult to do because obviously it's difficult to weigh a chance of larger future reductions versus a certain but maybe smaller reduction right now. But I think that the mitigation that I mentioned previously and the responses that I mentioned previously to me to believe that the most certain and most important impact was reducing tariffs right now, and that the more speculative and potentially not even comparably as large impact of reducing tariffs in the future was less important. That's how we saw the debate. It makes sense. I can also give more personal feedback, perhaps tomorrow, if you'd like.